Montana Territory, July 1883, the woman stepped off the stagecoach with dust on her boots and a pistol tucked beneath her coat, and the cowboy leaning against the post by the livery could not make himself look away. Her name, he would learn later, was Rosalie Tilden. She was 24 and headed nowhere in particular, just passing through on her way to Wyoming or maybe Oregon, she said. She had no husband, no family left, and no reason to stay anywhere longer than a night. But right then, standing in the late afternoon sun in the dusty street of Elk Hollow, she looked like trouble and hope all tied into one. Silas Vane was 37 and had not worn his wedding ring in 5 years. Not since the sickness took his wife, and the Colorado courts gave his 2 children Clara and Caleb to her sister down in Denver. He had not fought the ruling. He had not fought for much of anything since. But that woman Rosalie, she looked like someone who still knew how to fight. She walked straight past the saloon and into the general store, not saying a word to anyone. Silas watched her go, jaw tight, hands still at his sides. He had cattle to check on, a rusted windmill to fix, and no business chasing strangers. But something pulled at him, same as the way his daughter used to tug on his coat when she was scared. By the time he walked into the store, Rosalie had already asked old Mr. Cartwright for a map, a box of bullets, and a jar of pickled beets. She turned when Silas's boots crossed the floorboards behind her. "You the sheriff?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "No," Silas said. "Just a man wondering why you look like you expect someone to come after you." She stared at him for a second longer than needed. "Then, you always ask strangers questions like that. Only the ones who carry themselves like they have been running for a while." Rosalie paid for her things and walked out without answering him. He followed her, did not know why, but he did. Out on the street, she climbed up on the hitching rail, watching the stagecoach drive off in a cloud of dust. "You planning to sleep out under the stars?" he asked. "I have done it before. There is a room at the boarding house, clean bed. Lock on the door. I do not need help." "That is good," he said, "because I am not offering help, just a direction." She paused, then gave him a tight nod and started walking toward the boarding house. Silas stood there a moment, wondering what the hell he was doing. Then he went to check on his cattle, just like always. He did not see her again until 3 days later, when he rode into town early and saw her standing in front of the mercantile, pistol drawn, yelling at a man with a knife. One of the Carson brothers' mean bastards who thought women traveling alone were easy pickings. Silas dismounted fast and stepped between them before either one made a move. "She is under my protection now," he told the man, voice low and steady. Carson laughed. "Since when do you take in strays, Vane?" "Since now." Carson spat in the dirt and walked off, muttering curses. Rosalie stood behind Silas, her breath sharp, jaw locked. The barrel of her pistol was still raised. "You all right?" he asked without turning. "I had it handled." "I know." He turned to face her. "But I did not come to watch." She lowered her gun slowly. "I do not need you." "Maybe not," he said, "but I am still here." That night she knocked on the door of his cabin on the far ridge. She looked tired, like someone who had not slept a full night in months. "I do not want your charity," she said. "Then do not take it," he answered. "Just stay somewhere that does not smell like mold and whiskey." She hesitated, then stepped inside. The days that followed were quiet. Rosalie worked with her hands, mended his shirts, cleaned out the henhouse, even helped mend a fence without being asked. She still slept in the small guest room, door closed every night, but something between them started to shift. Silas found himself making 2 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1. He built a swing for the porch, even though no one had asked. She left her boots by the door like she meant to be there a while. They never talked about feelings. They just lived side by side, like 2 people who had lost too many things to say what they were afraid to want again. Then one afternoon, a telegram came to the post office. Silas rode in to pick it up and found Rosalie already there, standing rigid with the paper in her hands. He read it over her shoulder. "Rosalie Tilden, stop, your father dead, stop, come home, stop." She tucked the telegram into her coat pocket. "I did not even know he was still alive," she said, her voice low. "We left when I was 15. He was not a kind man." Silas searched her face. "You have anyone waiting?" "No, just his debts." She looked at him then. I told myself I would go west and never look back, but I do not know where to go now. Stay, Silas said, her eyes flicked up to meet his. I do not want to be just passing through anymore, she whispered. He stepped closer, slow. Then do not be. She looked up at him, and something in her cracked open. She leaned forward, and he caught her in his arms. Her fingers curled into his shirt, like she finally let herself need someone. Later that night, by the fire, she wrapped herself in his old wool blanket and watched the flames flicker. I never thought I would want a home again, she said quietly. Silas looked at her across the orange glow. You made me want to be a husband again, he said, voice raw. I never thought I would. Rosalie stared at him, eyes wide. Then she smiled a real, bright smile and leaned across the space between them. I am not running anymore, she said. Good, he breathed. Because I am not letting you go. The wind carried the smell of pine and river rock through the open windows of the cabin. It was nearing the edge of summer, when the heat pressed quiet against the land and the light stretched long into evening. Rosalie stood at the edge of Silas's vegetable patch, sleeves rolled, hands caked in the rich soil. She hadn't asked to plant anything, just found the seeds in a worn canvas bag beneath the shelf, and decided the ground could use something more than weeds. Silas leaned against the porch post, watching her fingers press squash seed into the earth. She worked with a quiet rhythm, sleeves damp with sweat, hair pinned up in a way that left her neck bare to the sun. You ever work land before? He asked. Her voice came steady. The man my mother married after we left my father had a small farm near Reading. He drank through most of it, but I remember the planting. I figured you for a gunslinger, he said. I figured you for a man who didn't talk much. He smiled, not answering. She kept kneeling in the dirt, planting row after row like it meant something. That night she brought in wild onion and tucked it into the beans. The meal was quiet, forks scraping gently, the fire popping low. Afterward, Silas took down his rifle and began oiling it by lamplight. You expecting trouble? She asked, drying her hands on a rag. No, he said, but I've learned not to wait for it to knock. She crossed the room and sat beside him, watching as he worked the cloth through the chamber. My father never let me touch a rifle, she said. Said women had no place holding something that could kill. You want to learn, she paused. You'd teach me. He set the rifle down gently on the table and met her eyes. You're not someone who waits to be told what she can do. They went out the next morning, just after dawn, walking up into the hills where the sagebrush grew thick between the rocks. Silas carried the rifle slung across his back, and Rosalie brought a flask of coffee wrapped in oilcloth. The sun hadn't yet crested the ridge, and the air still held the cool weight of night. He showed her how to stand feet steady, shoulder firm, and guided her fingers around the stock with quiet patience. She fired once, the shot ringing out over the valley, and grinned as the can rolled down the slope. That was for Jack Tilden, she said, reloading. He didn't ask which sin her father had committed to earn it. Some pains didn't need explaining. By the third shot, her shoulder was bruising, but she didn't stop. She didn't flinch either. Later, as they walked back down the trail, she broke the silence. You ever think about going to Denver? He kept his gaze forward. It crosses my mind. You'd see your children again. I wouldn't know what to say to them now. She didn't reply, just let her hand brush his lightly as they walked. He didn't pull away. That evening, a storm rolled in, low and heavy, the kind that split the sky and rattled the windows. They sat close on the floor, backs against the hearthstone, listening to the rain drum the roof. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, I used to dream about Oregon. Thought maybe I'd find a piece of land, raise goats, live quiet. You could still do that. I could, she said. But then I'd be alone again. He turned toward her, studying the firelight on her face. I have a piece of land, he said. No goats, but I've got space. Rosalie stared into the flames. You really want a woman who carries as much as I do? I don't want someone empty, he said. I want someone who stayed upright even when everything tried to knock her down. She looked at him then, and what passed between them wasn't heat or hunger, it was steadier than that. Like something that had been building in the quiet, beneath every shared task and silence and glance. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He reached for her hand, rough against his. Then let's plant something worth keeping. The first frost came early that year. Not a hard freeze, just a thin veil of silver across the grass, enough to startle the summer out of the earth. Rosalie stepped barefoot onto the porch before dawn, wool shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, and watched her breath rise in the air. Silas came out behind her, carrying a steaming tin mug, and handed it over without comment. She wrapped her hands around the warmth, eyes still fixed on the pale horizon. "I always thought the cold would bother me more," she said. "It will," he replied. "Give it a few weeks." She glanced sideways at him. "You always so hopeful in the morning," he shrugged. "I'm just honest." They stood like that for a while, quiet, close, the porch creaking beneath their weight as the sun pushed slow and golden over the ridge. She didn't ask where he had to be, and he didn't ask why she hadn't gone yet. Later that day, Silas hauled a load of hay in from the lower pasture. When he came back, he found Rosalie in the barn, coaxing a hesitant bay mare into letting her lift a cracked hoof. "She's been favoring the back leg," she said without looking up. "She lets you near her. Only when I hum." He leaned against the stall door. "You always hum at stubborn animals, only the ones that remind me of me." The mare snorted and gave a small shake, then finally settled with a heavy breath. Rosalie pressed her palm gently against the fetlock, steadying her. "You ever think about getting more stock?" she asked. "Not since last winter. Had to cull down after the ice storm." "You'd let me help if you did." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Wasn't sure how long you were planning on staying." "I wasn't either," she said, straightening, "but I keep finding reasons." He nodded once, slow. "Then I'll start mending the west fence. If we're adding heads, we'll need it solid." That night, she brought out a length of linen she'd been keeping in her trunk, stained in one corner, frayed at the edge, but still whole. She spread it across the kitchen table and began stitching a seam with even, sharp motions. Silas sat down across from her, his fingers still streaked from grease and rust. "What's it for?" he asked. "A curtain," she said. "The guest room window's bare." "You planning on staying in the guest room much longer?" Her needle paused just for a second. "Depends." He waited. She stitched another few inches before speaking again. "Depends if you want this to be your house or ours." He met her gaze across the table. "Depends if you'll marry me." Rosalie's fingers fell still. "Is that a proposal?" she asked. "It's a start." She set the needle down and folded her hands in her lap. "You sure, Rosalie?" he said, voice low and even. "You made me want to be a husband again." She didn't blink. "And you're not asking because I stayed longer than you expected. I'm asking because I want you here when the snow comes. I want you here when it melts." She exhaled slowly, then reached across the table. Her fingers found his calloused and warm. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, Silas." The next morning, she took down the curtain she'd started and began cutting it into strips. He watched from the doorway. "What happened to the window?" he asked. She looked back, smiling. "I figured we'd need something for the table at the wedding." They were married 3 weeks later in the chapel near the river bend. Reverend Pike said the words, and 6 neighbors stood in quiet witness. Rosalie wore a dress borrowed from the widow Madsen, and Silas had cleaned up the old coat he hadn't worn since Denver. Afterward, they walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, boots quiet on the dirt path. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind moved gentle through the trees, Silas wrapped his arms around her beneath the quilt she had mended. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow beat of his heart. "I never expected to belong anywhere," she whispered. He kissed her temple, slow and sure. "You belong here," he said, "with me." And that was the last thing either of them said that night. The silence that followed was warm and earned and full. The snow came down thick and early, blanketing the ridge before the end of November. Rosalie stood at the cabin window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the flakes drift against the stacked woodpile. Silas was out in the lean-to, the rhythmic sound of axe to log carrying through the white hush like a heartbeat. She'd pulled a faded ledger from the shelf that morning, one of Silas's, from before, and had begun writing in the margins. Not numbers, but notes. Which hens laid regularly, which fence posts leaned, what seeds they might trade for come spring. Her script was small, careful. The kind of writing that came from a mind used to accounting for things no one else noticed. When Silas came back in, brushing snow from his shoulders, he paused by the table. "You're in my books," he said. She didn't look up. They weren't doing much good closed. He set the kindling down by the hearth, then crossed to stand behind her. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, warm through the wool of her dress. You always keep track of what you care about, she turned a page. Only what I mean to keep. He leaned down, kissed her hair once, then moved to stoke the fire. That night the wind picked up, rattling dry pine needles across the roof. Rosalie sat cross-legged on the floor, mending one of Silas's shirts with a needle she'd sharpened against a flat stone. He watched her from the rocker, thumb pressed into the soft binding of a book he hadn't opened in years. I don't remember how to be a father, he said, quiet. She didn't stop the stitch, didn't look up. You remember how to listen, he nodded once. Then you'll be fine. He closed the book. Clara's birthday's in March. I used to carve her little animals from scrap wood. She liked the ones with crooked legs best. Rosalie tied off the thread and set the shirt aside. You want to send her one. I wouldn't know where to start. You already did. She stood, crossed the room, and took his hand. We'll make something together. In the weeks that followed, the world outside narrowed to the cabin, the barn, and the path to the stream. They moved around each other with quiet, understanding Rosalie drying herbs near the stove, Silas checking traps for snowshoe hares, their days marked by small, necessary tasks that made no room for doubt. One morning she stepped out to find Silas smoothing planks across a narrow trough behind the barn. What's that? She asked, pulling her shawl tighter. Smokehouse, he said. We'll need it if we want to keep meat longer than a week. She tucked her hands beneath her arms. You planning that far ahead now? He didn't look at her. I reckon I am. When the boards were up and the chimney sealed, Rosalie helped him hang the first strips of venison. Her hands were red from the cold, but steady. Later, as they walked back to the cabin through the deepening snow, she glanced sideways. You ever want to leave this place? She asked. He shook his head. This land's been with me longer than nearly anything else. I know where the ground sinks and where the deer bed down. I don't need more than that. She was quiet a moment. Then, I used to think I'd have to keep moving to stay free. You still think that? No, she said. Now I think freedom might just be knowing someone will come find you if you're late getting home. He stopped walking. She did too. I'd find you, he said. She met his eyes. I know. They didn't speak again until they were inside, boots off, the door barred against the wind. He poured tea while she laid out the last of the beans, and the firelight cast long shadows across the floorboards. As the wind howled through the trees, Rosalie rested her head on Silas's shoulder. You were right, she said. About what? You made me want something I didn't believe in anymore. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Then we're even, he said. In mid-March, the ice began to loosen its grip on the earth. Water ran beneath the snow in threads, trickling down from the hills, and the air carried that first raw scent of thaw. The sky still held winter's pale tones, but the wind had changed, less biting, more restless. Rosalie stood outside the cabin, hands tucked into her apron pockets, watching the sap drip from a sugar pine behind the barn. She tied a tin bucket beneath the wound in the bark that morning, just to see if it would run. It had. Silas came up behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. His sleeves were rolled and his forearms were streaked with oil and wood dust. That sap for cooking, he asked. For trade, she said. The Madsons lost their cow last month. I figured they could use sweetening. He squinted toward the tree. You always think in other people's shortages, she shrugged. I've lived through enough of my own. He nodded and didn't press. The silence between them had grown easy. Later that afternoon, she cleared the top shelf in the back pantry and began arranging jars pickled beetroot, dried wild mint, a sealed tin of chicory she'd bartered for with a family passing through. When she stepped down from the stool, she turned to find Silas holding a folded piece of paper in one hand. This came through the post, he said. From Denver. She wiped her palms on her skirt before taking it. The seal had been broken already. I opened it, he admitted. Didn't want to keep it from you, but I also didn't want to wait. Rosalie unfolded it slowly. Her eyes moved over the words, her brow tightening as she read. It's from Clara's aunt, she said. She's remarried, moving to New York. She's asking if you'll take the children. He nodded once. She says they're both healthy. Clara turns 12 next week. Rosalie folded the paper again and set it on the table. You could go to them. I could, he said. Then, after a moment, but I'd rather bring them here. Her voice was quiet. You think they'd want that? I don't know, he said. But I'd like to try. She looked at him for a long time before speaking again. They'll need space, a room of their own, and Clara's old enough to want books, maybe a desk. I'll build one, he said. She crossed the room and took his hand. Then let's send word. Tell her yes. 2 weeks later, Silas hitched the wagon and left for the rail post in Helena. He returned with 2 children bundled in wool and carrying small satchels. Clara stepped down first, chin high, her eyes sweeping the property with a guarded kind of curiosity. Caleb followed, quieter, one hand gripping his father's coat, the other holding a carved rabbit, legs uneven, ears worn smooth. Rosalie met them at the porch. She didn't reach for them, just opened the door and stood aside. There's warm bread inside, she said, and fresh butter. If you're hungry. Clara stared at her for a long moment before nodding. Caleb didn't let go of Silas's hand until they were all seated at the table. The first few days were cautious. Clara kept mostly to herself, reading an old almanac they found beneath the bed. Caleb followed Rosalie as she worked, never speaking much, just watching. On the 4th morning, he helped her grind oats at the table without being asked. Your hands are strong, she told him. He looked up at her, eyes wide. I help Papa sometimes, she nodded. That shows. By the 2nd week, Clara had begun asking questions, where the creek was, how far to town if the horse was named. She took to the hills on foot, sometimes gone for an hour, always back before dusk. When Rosalie offered to sew her a new skirt, Clara sat beside her and asked for pine green. The house shifted, slowly. Rosalie made a place for their shoes by the door. Silas built a 2nd bed in the guest room and carved a small shelf for the girls' books. Caleb brought back smooth stones from the stream and lined them along the windowsill. One night, after the children were asleep, Silas found Rosalie sitting on the porch, shawl around her shoulders, a cup of warm cider in her hands. They're settling, she said. He sat beside her and passed her a small folded cloth. Inside was a carved horse, short-legged, tail curled, the grain of the wood still visible. I made it for Clara, he said, but I think she's past toys. Rosalie turned it over in her hands. She's still a child. She just had to grow quiet to survive. She's like you, he said. She looked at him. And Caleb, Silas smiled. He's like I was. She leaned against his shoulder. Then he'll be all right. The days grew longer and the land softened. Silas taught the children to fish with lines made from horsehair. Rosalie gave Clara her mother's old thimble and showed her how to mend a hem. Caleb planted beans in the soil behind the cabin and checked them each morning, solemn and patient. One Sunday, they all rode to a gathering at the Madsons' new barn. The children played with others their age. Silas stood beside Rosalie near the fence, watching Clara run, her hair unbound, laughter rising sharp and bright through the late spring air. She's smiling, he said. Rosalie touched his hand. So are you. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Silas pulled Rosalie into the small kitchen and kissed her, slow and certain. This is the life I never thought I'd have again, he whispered. She looked up at him. Then let's keep it, and they did. That summer, Clara built herself a shelf for her books, and Caleb picked the first ripe tomato from his garden. Silas added a 2nd rocking chair to the porch, and Rosalie planted lavender along the fence line. They lived quiet, steady lives. Not without work, not without effort, but full with warmth and belonging stitched into every corner of the home they made together. When the first snow came again, it found them all gathered around the hearth, Rosalie with her mending, Silas carving a new toy, Clara reading aloud, and Caleb curled asleep at their feet. The fire burned strong, and no one was waiting for anything else. They had everything they needed. And each other, forever.